Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Introduction to American Government. Today, I want to take some time to discuss the bureaucracy. I want to talk about what the bureaucracy is, what it does, the different levels and types of bureaucratic entities, and talk a little bit about how the bureaucracy itself is staffed. So, starting off here, bureaucracy gets a bad rap. In our culture, in our society, we tend to take a negative view of the bureaucracy. Look no further than Zootopia or The Simpsons or any other pop culture reference here. We then tend to think about the bureaucracy in terms of it being ineffective, in terms of it being slow, in terms of it being ultimately frustrating to work with. Um, this is in many ways deserved, but this is also in many ways by design. And we'll discuss why that is in just a few minutes here. But first, let's describe what the bureaucracy actually is. When we're talking about the bureaucracy, we tend to be talking about executive agencies. When we're talking about the federal level, we're talking about those federal executive agencies. Fundamentally, bureaucracy is the doing stuff part of government here. When we look at the structure of government, the legislature makes laws. The executive branch is tasked with executing those laws. The bureaucracy, therefore, is the means through which the executive branch executes those laws. Now, Chapter 13 discussed the closest elements of the bureaucracy to the president: the White House office, the executive office of the presidency, as well as the 15 cabinet departments heads. The federal bureaucracy itself is a lot bigger than those three categories. And in order to demonstrate this, let's first walk through an illustrative example. Say that, hypothetically, and this is kind of a weird hypothetical here, but hypothetically, say I want to build a bridge. What do I do? Well, I am pretty handy with a hammer, a drill, and the things like that, but laying concrete, structural work, probably not up my alley. So I'm going to hire a contractor. I'll shop around, try and find a contractor who A, has experience in doing the job, and B, will do it at a relatively affordable rate. So one-to-one relationship there. Myself and whoever or whatever company I decide to contract to do that task. It's a little bit more involved for the federal government and government in general. First off, Congress needs to decide that it is a priority to build a bridge. Usually, this is a manifestation or a reflection of constituent preferences. Suppose people live in an area where they have to drive a tremendous amount of time around a body of water, they would be well served by a bridge. The individual senators and representatives from that state, from that area, they wheel and deal, they make compromises, they negotiate with their fellows within that specific chamber, and they finally attach appropriations language or spending language to some particular piece of legislation in order to get it passed into law. Say all of that has gone successful, there is now a federal piece of legislation, a bill, that requires the federal government to build a certain bridge. This is passed over then to the executive branch, and the executive branch is now tasked with fulfilling that federal legislation. The way they're going to do this is first they're going to route it through one of the cabinet departments. Each of the cabinet departments have areas of what we might call jurisdiction over which they exert authority. In this circumstance, is probably going to be the Department of Transportation. But looking at the Department of Transportation as a monolith is inappropriate here. We have to break it down into its constituent parts. This will probably be the responsibility of the Federal Highway Administration, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. There's going to be subordinate elements of the Department of Transportation that are going to be responsible for actually executing this task. After it's kind of worked its way through the bureaucratic milieu, there will be specific offices that are tasked with coming up with what specifically are going to be the contract requirements. Is it okay for it to be a suspension bridge versus some other kind of bridge? Are there environmental impacts? A different aspect of the bureaucracy is going to be tasked with fulfilling those environmental impact surveys and the like. So, whichever element within the Department of Transportation is responsible for this project, they're going to put together the contract requirements and then they're going to solicit bids on that contract. These are published on a federal website, and contractors can go through these and see which of these they want to actually bid on. After the bids are solicited through a presumably non political and independent process, they're going to select the contractor with the lowest bid, and they will then appoint officials in order to oversee the process of that bridge actually being constructed. As you might imagine, this takes a little bit longer than if I was simply to contract with a contracting company to build that bridge. There are a lot of different steps within this process, and it's not all red tape, it's not all bureaucratic bloat. A lot of these steps are designed to result in efficient outcomes for government, as well as ensuring compliance with other areas of federal legislation. Now, that's one task. Think about all of the myriad tasks that the federal government actually accomplishes. We can start to get a rough idea of the scope of the bureaucracy and the millions of Americans who work within it. Moreover, it is not just a case of selectively enforcing whatever the federal legislation comes out. The federal bureaucracy is required to fulfill federal law. These are not tasks that they can pick and choose which they want to do and which they don't. They have to do these things. And the executive branch, as kind of the broad scale here, is required to oversee the entities that are responsible for fulfilling the tasks that the legislature has set out. And, at least in principle, the legislature has set out those tasks in service of their constituents' preferences as to what they want the federal government to do. And this is one of the reasons why, over the course of the 20th century, we've seen a dramatic increase in the size and scope of the federal bureaucracy. Fundamentally, the American people have asked more and more of the federal government throughout those decades. And as a result, the federal government scope and the federal bureaucracy in particular has expanded to meet the desires of the American public. Now, it is worth noting here that the federal bureaucracy itself has remained relatively static in terms of its size over the preceding few decades. This has coincided with the principle of devolution, of a move towards home rule, of trying to empower the state and local bureaucracies, the state and local governments, to take a more active role. The textbook discusses this in good detail, so I won't go into it in too much detail here. Now, keep in mind that most of the bureaucracy in the United States is actually at the state and at the local level. The federal government's relatively small in comparison to the size of those state and local bureaucracies. In fact, it's actually kind of rare for us as private individuals to interact with the federal bureaucracy in a meaningful way outside of course, tax season. Now, what are the different types of bureaucratic entities here? Well, at the kind of upper broad level, we have those cabinet level departments or agencies. We sometimes call these executive agencies. There's 15 of these kind of broad categories, but there's also executive agencies within those kind of cabinet level departments. Think about the Department of Homeland Security and TSA, the people in blue that you see at the airport. The Department of Homeland Security has a much broader set of priorities than does the TSA. The TSA is the agency that is tasked with conducting and fulfilling a specific aim of the Department of Transportation. Or, I'm sorry, the Department of Homeland Security. Now, there's a couple other different types of executive agencies at the federal level. There are also independent executive agencies. Think the CIA, think NASA. These are governmental entities, not really within the scope of one of these cabinet departments, that are tasked with fulfilling a very specific aim. NASA, right? Maintaining satellite communications, space exploration, maintaining the orbital infrastructure, and the like there. We also have independent regulatory agencies, things like the National Transportation Safety Board, things like the Federal Communications Commission or the Federal Elections Commission. They have responsibility for overseeing the different parts of American society, politics, the government, whatever it might be, and ensuring that all participants within that sphere align with government regulations and federal legislation. Finally, we have government corporations. These are government entities that are tasked with providing a service in line with profit making, though profit isn't really the main motivation there. These generally arise, like Amtrak or the Tennessee Valley Authority, these generally arise for areas of economic life where it is a public desire to see that these functions are fulfilled, but the whatever for whatever reason the profit margin isn't really there. It's very unlikely for a private entity to actually exist within this space, and therefore the government steps in to kind of fill that role. Now, those are the different types of bureaucratic entities. How are these different types determined? Well, in large part, this is due to Congress. They can authorize different bureaucratic entities, and the president and the executive branch more broadly have some authority over how the executive branch itself is organized. But fundamentally, it is up to Congress to authorize these different agencies, authorize these different entities, and the structure itself is kind of a coordination process between the president and the legislative branch. So that is what the bureaucracy does. That's the kind of structure of the bureaucracy. Who actually are the bureaucracy, and how do we get people staffing these agencies? Who are the bureaucrats? Your textbook talks about the transition from a system of patronage to a system of merit based hiring. This came towards the end of the 19th century. The assassination of William McKinley was in large part a motivation for this. Prior to the changes wrought by the Pendleton Act, by the Progressive Era, and eventually the Hatch Act, prior to this, there was a system of patronage or a system of spoils, a spoils system as it's sometimes called. Within this system, those bureaucratic jobs, be it the postmaster, be it one of the cabinet level positions, whatever it might be, the bureaucrats, the civil servants within that, were not hired meritoriously. Instead, whoever won the election got to pick who would fulfill these roles. And as a result, competence, merit was not the basis for these appointments. Instead, it was political loyalty, and specifically, it was a reward for political support in the previous election. Suppose you were running for governor or state senate, whatever it might be. So long as an influential individual within that community, within a community, saw to it that that community voted for you in that election, you would reward that individual with a position in the state bureaucracy for state senators, representatives, and governor, and the same thing at the federal level. This is an issue for a variety of reasons, but one of the big ones is this does not promote an efficient or effective bureaucracy. Instead, where hiring and placement is the result of political loyalty, that is what is prioritized. And so the ability of the government to actually accomplish the task that it needs to do is thereby hindered. Now, I brought up McKinley previously. The reason, or one of the reasons that this system changed, is that a spoils or a patronage seeker, someone who is seeking a government job, was disgruntled that the McKinley administration was not forthcoming with that job, and thus assassinated the president. In this context, the American public was horrified that such a system would lead to the assassination of a sitting president. This was only a couple decades after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And as a result, the political incentives changed such that the Pendleton Act was actually able to be passed. This act required merit based hiring through a civil service exam. And despite some significant changes throughout the 20th century, this system remains in place today. Now, in order to enter the civil service, in order to become a federal bureaucrat, you must take a civil service exam, ensuring that you have some degree of competency, some degree of knowledge, and some degree of expertise that justifies you earning a position within the federal bureaucracy. Some of the other changes that were made during the Progressive Era were to try and remove the political nature of the bureaucracy itself. Towards this effect, the bureaucracy is intended to be nonpartisan. It's intended to be rigorously impartial, as well as some other elements like being hierarchical, basically running on paperwork, having merit based hiring and firing, and having a division of labor and specialization. Fundamentally, when we think back to the beginning, when I talked about our cultural or societal perceptions of the bureaucracy, the things that make a bureaucracy efficient, the things that make a bureaucracy good, if we want to use that term, are the same things that render when the public interacts with that bureaucracy having a negative view. If you're talking about an effective bureaucracy, you're talking about one that is going to be governed by paperwork, by arcane or Byzantine rules that you and I may not be intimately familiar with. But this is the core aspect of a good bureaucracy. Bureaucracy needs rigid rules, paperwork, this kind of impartial civil servants interacting with the public in order to be efficient, in order to be unbiased and impartial, and ultimately nonpartisan. So think about that the next time that you hear someone bad mouthing the bureaucracy, or like in Zootopia, when there's a scene about the civil servants working at the DMV. Now, one additional wrinkle here, civil servants are the staff that make up the vast bulk of the bureaucracy, both at the federal and at the state level. But at the federal level, we need to discuss for a moment the what we might call middle managers. These are members of the senior executive service. After years of meritorious service within the federal bureaucracy as civil servants, they work their way up through the bureaucratic hierarchy, and eventually, given a long enough time and a good enough track record, they can move into the position of the senior executive service. These are the middle managers. These are the ones that connect the rank and file civil servants to those political appointees, those heads of the cabinet departments or heads of the CIA and NASA, and serve as kind of an institutional means to connect the two levels, the top down political and the bottom up meritorious civil service. And taken collectively, this is broadly speaking how the federal bureaucracy works. It can be a somewhat arcane, somewhat difficult system, and timeliness and cost efficiency are not generally words that we associate with the bureaucracy. But fundamentally, the bureaucracy is the means by which the government gets things done. And very often, they do a pretty good job at balancing all of the competing incentives that make up the federal legal system. So that's all I have for you today. And that's all I have for you for the course. This is the final video lecture. Now, before we go, I just want to go over the end of the course structure. Your normal course requirements, graded components are still due this Sunday by midnight. The readings, the inquisitive, the discussion board, this video lecture, the reflection paper, and everything else. But one additional thing to note, you will see the blue course evaluations in the left hand, or I guess your perspective would be the left hand side of your screen, that bar. That is where you can provide course evaluations for this course. I am always trying to improve the course structure, how this is taught, and this is especially true in an online format. So please do take the time to go through the course evaluations. I do read them, and they are enormously influential for the future shape of this course. So, I hope you have found this course useful. I hope you have not been inundated, given the 6 week structure of the course, with work. But ultimately, I hope that this course has better prepared you to engage with the political system in a meaningful way. I've enjoyed speaking with you via email, and I've enjoyed reading your reflection papers, your discussion posts, and the like. So, as always, feel free to reach out to me with any concerns, with any questions, and otherwise, enjoy the rest of your summer.